Victorian era was a very cruel time, full of suffering for innocent people. Glamorous balls, luxurious dresses, technological progress, and a great empire on which the sun never set were just a facade. It was a world where poverty was considered not a misfortune, but a moral crime deserving of punishment. To combat it, special institutions were created that promised shelter, but in reality became traps with no way out. They were not prisons in the usual sense of the word. Bars on the windows were not the main means of control. Watch this video to the end, and you will learn how the most enlightened society of its time built an ideal system of isolation for its unnecessary citizens, and why free exit from these walls was only an illusion. What if I told you that the worst prisons were the ones where people came voluntarily? In 1834, the British Parliament passed the Newport Law, which completely changed the attitude towards poverty. It was not just a reform, but a cold and calculated social experiment designed to eradicate poverty as a phenomenon. The law was based on a simple but cruel idea. The state should not help the poor for no reason. Assistance had to be earned by going through the workhouse system. Institutions with such harsh conditions that only a person on the verge of despair would decide to go there. This is how the famous workhouse test came about. The idea was to make life within these walls so unbearable that any job outside, even the lowest paid, would seem like a salvation. The architects of this system believed that in this way they would weed out the lazy from the deserving poor. It was a real war against the very idea of social assistance. The entire system was based on the philosophy of utilitarianism, which was popular at the time. Its supporters, representatives of the middle and upper classes, believed that actions should be judged by their usefulness to society as a whole. From their point of view, supporting the poor was an inefficient waste of resources. Therefore, workhouses were designed not as shelters, but as correctional institutions. Their goal was not to feed the hungry, but to re-educate them through hard labor and strict discipline. Poverty was declared a personal moral failure, not a consequence of economic problems. This logic gave society complete freedom. The aristocracy and the wealthy middle class could enjoy their wealth with a clear conscience. After all, if a poor person ended up in a workhouse, it was their own fault. This approach created the perfect alibi for public indifference. Why sympathize with those who, it was believed, did not want to work? Thus, the brilliant empire created a mechanism that hid poverty from view. Workhouses became a symbol of the era, a place feared more than any prison. They were the visible embodiment of Victorian morality, where compassion gave way to cold efficiency. It was the price paid for outward gloss and order. The system was designed to instill fear and shame in the poor. The mere mention of a workhouse made people agree to any job, even the most hellish. It was an invisible whip that drove England's industrial machine. It was not just a set of buildings, but an entire ideology embodied in stone and rules. An ideology that placed order and economy above human dignity. And this system worked flawlessly. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. Do you think the creation of such cruel conditions can be justified by the pursuit of public good and order? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about how ordinary walls can break the human spirit? The workhouse was not just a building, but a machine for suppressing the will, and every detail of its architecture served this purpose. They were built according to standard designs, often resembling prisons or barracks, so that their very appearance would inspire awe. High, unadorned brick walls topped with broken glass reliably isolated the inhabitants from the outside world. Small windows located high up allowed nothing but the gray sky to be seen. This created a feeling of a closed, claustrophobic space from which there was no escape. The interior layout was based on the principle of strict segregation. Men, women, and the elderly were separated and kept in different wings of the building. Families who entered the workhouse together were separated on the first day and could go months without seeing each other. The central element of many workhouses was an inner courtyard, surrounded on all sides by buildings. It was visible from the administration windows, allowing the guards to constantly monitor the movements of the inhabitants. Any violation of the rules was immediately noticed and punished. The corridors were long, echoing, and cold, and the sleeping quarters were huge wards filled with rows of simple bunks. There was no personal space whatsoever. People were always in plain sight. This destroyed any sense of privacy and dignity. The color scheme of the interiors was dull and monotonous. Gray, brown, and beige paint. There were no bright spots, no decorations, nothing that could please the eye. This monotony was part of the psychological pressure. Even the dining rooms were designed for maximum control. Long tables and benches, at which people sat in complete silence, emphasized the impersonal, barracks-like character of the institution. Mealtimes were transformed from a simple human ritual into part of a strict disciplinary system. The building was designed to minimize contact between different groups of inmates. This prevented the formation of friendships and conspiracies. Everyone was alone in a crowd of equally lonely and oppressed people. Everything in the architecture of the workhouse told a person, you are nobody. You are just a number, a cog in the system, and your life is completely subject to the rules established here. It was an environment perfectly suited to breaking the will to resist. This oppressive atmosphere was not accidental, but a deliberate part of the system. But the physical walls were only half the story. In the next chapter, you will learn what invisible but no less formidable barriers were used to control people's minds. This is what happens behind closed doors when the system decides that you are no longer a person. The process of entering the labor camp was a ritual designed to erase a person's past and strip them of their individuality. It began from the very first moments behind the gates. First, all of the new arrivals' personal clothing was taken away. These items, no matter how old and worn they were the last link to their former lives. They were a symbol of who a person was before they crossed that threshold. In exchange, they were given uniforms, rough, shapeless clothes of the same cut and dull color. They were designed to be durable and cheap, but at the same time to deprive the wearer of any signs of individuality. Everyone became alike. This was followed by a mandatory bath and haircut, often a buzz cut. This was done under the pretext of hygiene, but it also had a powerful psychological effect. People were deprived of their hairstyles, another important part of their image. All personal belongings, even the most insignificant ones, such as family photos or letters, were confiscated. They were put into a bag with a number and taken to a warehouse. They could only be returned upon leaving the institution. Names also lost their meaning. Inmates were often addressed by their number or simply by their surname, without any respectful prefixes. This turned a living person into an accounting unit in the registry. The rules of conduct were extremely strict and regulated every aspect of life. Talking during work or meals was prohibited. Any display of emotion or disobedience was punished. Monotony was another tool. Every day was an exact copy of the previous one. The same wake-up call, the same food, the same meaningless work. This cycle deprived people of any hope for change and plunged them into apathy. The system was designed to make people forget who they were in the past. He was no longer John Smith, a craftsman with a family and hobbies. He was simply a pauper, an inhabitant of workhouse number such and such. As a result of this process, people lost touch with their selves. Their will was suppressed, and their ability to make independent decisions atrophied. The system turned them into obedient mechanisms, perfectly fitted into the daily routine. What I am about to show you was forbidden even in some prisons of that time. The daily routine in the workhouse was the main instrument of discipline, turning life into an endless, exhausting cycle. It began long before dawn with the sharp ringing of a bell. After rising, there was a quick and cold procedure of washing and making beds according to a strict pattern. This was followed by breakfast, which usually consisted of oatmeal porridge and a piece of bread. Meals were eaten in complete silence under the supervision of the guards. Right after breakfast, the workday began, lasting 10-12 hours with a short break for lunch. The nature of the work was unique. Its main purpose was not to produce something useful, but to exhaust people and make their stay in the workhouse unbearable. One of the most common types of such labor was oakum picking. The inmates spent hours untangling old tarred ropes into individual fibers. This monotonous, dirty work crippled their fingers and brought no satisfaction. Another occupation was stone crushing. Men sat in separate booths and spent whole days breaking cobblestones into small gravel with hammers, which was then used for road construction. It was hard, deafening, and dangerous work. Women usually did laundry, sewed uniforms, or worked in the kitchen. Their work was no less exhausting. They washed huge amounts of laundry in cold water with caustic alkali. The point of such work was not economic, but psychological. It was deliberately made humiliating and meaningless. It was supposed to instill in the inmates the idea that any occupation outside the camp was better than this existence. After the end of the working day, there was a meager dinner consisting of bread and a small amount of cheese or soup. Then there was a short time for prayer and lights out at the same bell ring. And the next day, everything was repeated with absolute precision. This relentless routine left no time or energy for reflection, communication, or any other activity. It turned people into automatons, mechanically carrying out orders. All their energy went into simply surviving another day. Why was such deliberate cruelty necessary in the organization of labor? But even this exhausting work required energy. In the next chapter, we will learn how scientists of the time calculated a diet that was supposed to sustain life, but not bring any pleasure. The food in the workhouse was not just meager, it was strictly scientific. Nutritionists and officials of the time developed a diet calculated with mathematical precision. Its purpose was to provide the minimum calories necessary to perform hard labor. The diet was based on the cheapest and most accessible foods: oats, bread, potatoes, and peas. Meat was rarely served, usually once a week in the form of a small piece in a watery soup. It was considered a luxury that had to be earned. The menu was approved centrally and did not change for years. For example, breakfast always consisted of a serving of oatmeal cooked in water. Lunch could be bread with cheese or potato soup. Monotony was a key element of the system. Day after day, week after week, people ate the same thing. This deprived eating of any pleasure, turning it into a purely mechanical process of replenishing energy. Each portion was measured with apothecary precision. The guards made sure that no one received a gram more than they were entitled to. Any attempts to get extra food or hide a piece of bread were severely punished. This diet was officially recognized as sufficient to maintain health. However, in practice, it kept people in a state of constant hunger. This made them weak, apathetic, and more obedient. The quality of the food was extremely low. Bread was often baked from the cheapest flour, and foreign substances could get into the porridge. But complaining about the food was useless and even dangerous. This food system was another way of humiliating people. It constantly reminded the inmates of their dependent position. They could not choose what to eat and had to be grateful even for the meager food they were given. Paradoxically, this diet was a source of pride for its creators. They believed they had found the perfect balance between saving money and keeping the paupers working. Human factors such as taste preferences or moral satisfaction from food were not taken into account. Thus, science was put at the service of a system of oppression. Cold calorie counting became another tool of control. It allowed people to be kept on the brink of survival, preventing them from dying or feeling like full-fledged human beings. What if I told you that the gates of the workhouse were never locked, but it was almost impossible to leave? Formally, any resident could leave the facility by notifying the administration a few hours in advance. This was a key difference from prison, and supporters of the system constantly pointed this out. However, this freedom was only an illusion. A person who walked out the gate found themselves in the same position they were in before they entered, but in even worse conditions. They had no money, no job, and no place to live. Upon leaving, they were given back their old, often worn-out clothes. The workhouse uniform remained the property of the institution. The person became destitute on the street again, but now they did not even have a roof over their head. The system was a vicious circle. People ended up in the workhouse because they had no work, and they couldn't leave to find work because it took time and energy to do so. Finding work while inside was practically impossible. Many who left the workhouse in the morning were forced to beg to be taken back by evening. After wandering around the city and finding no shelter or income, they returned to the hated walls. It was humiliating, but often the only way out. Such revolving doors were beneficial to the system. They proved that life on the outside was impossible for these people, and that the workhouse was their only salvation. This justified the very existence of these institutions. For many elderly and sick people, leaving was impossible in principle. They could not work and were completely dependent on the shelter. The workhouse became their last home and the place where they ended their lives. The psychological barrier was also very strong. After several months or years spent in conditions of complete subjugation, people lost their initiative and willpower. The thought of living independently on the outside caused them fear and uncertainty. Thus, the absence of locks on the gates was the most cunning trap. It created the appearance of choice where in fact there was none. The system held people not with chains, but with their own hopelessness. Was this a form of freedom or the most sophisticated kind of imprisonment? While some struggled to survive within these walls, others lived in a completely different world. In the next chapter, we will move to the luxurious mansions of the aristocracy to see the other side of Victorian society. The life of the British aristocracy was as far removed from the reality of the workhouses as possible. Their world consisted of country estates, London mansions, balls, and receptions. The day of a member of high society was scheduled down to the minute, but it consisted not of work, but of entertainment. An aristocrat's morning began with a late breakfast served in bed by servants. This was followed by visits, walks in the park, or horse riding. The main concern was observing complex etiquette and maintaining one's status in society. Lunches and dinners turned into real rituals, consisting of a dozen courses, exotic fruits, expensive wines, complex meat and fish dishes. All this was the norm. At the table, there were Swiatsky conversations about politics, horse racing, or the latest news from the colonies. Their income came from huge landholdings that were leased to farmers. Aristocrats rarely got involved in managing their lands, delegating this to stewards. They lived on rent without engaging in productive labor. The problem of poverty in their circles was discussed as an abstract topic. They could donate money to charity, but they did so more to maintain their reputation. They did not know and did not want to know the real life of the working class and the inhabitants of workhouses. Many of them sincerely believed that the existing order of things was natural and fair. They were the elite, born to rule, while the poor were where they were because of laziness or vice. The poor law seemed to them a wise and necessary solution. Their homes were filled with luxury items, silk wallpaper, mahogany furniture, works of art. Dozens of servants ensured their comfort, remaining virtually invisible. It was a world completely isolated from the problems of industrial England. While a person in a workhouse lost their name, an aristocrat took pride in their title and long pedigree. While a factory worker labored 14 hours a day, a gentleman could spend the entire day choosing a new tie. The contrast was stark. This glittering world, detached from reality, was the top of the social pyramid. Its prosperity was largely ensured by the cheap labor of those at the bottom, but the representatives of high society preferred not to think about it. Thus, two worlds existed side by side, almost without intersecting. One was a world of excess and idleness, the other a world of need and despair, and between them lay a chasm that was impossible to cross. Between the aristocracy and the workers was a rapidly growing middle class. Bankers, industrialists, doctors, lawyers, and clerks were the driving force of the Victorian era. Their main value was respectability, outward decorum, and financial stability. Members of the middle class were terrified of poverty. They saw the slums and workhouses and did everything they could to avoid ending up there. This fear drove them to work tirelessly and keep a tight rein on their spending. It was the middle class that was the main supporter of the New Poor Law and the workhouse system. They saw these institutions as a way to bring order and protect themselves from the dangerous lower classes. It was a measure of self-preservation. The family was the center of their universe. The head of the family, the man, was the undisputed authority, and the woman was the angel of the hearth, responsible for comfort and upbringing. Any deviation from this model was considered scandalous. They attached great importance to appearance. Clean clothes, a well-kept house, polite manners, all these were signs of their status. It was necessary to constantly demonstrate one's success and reliability to society. Their morals were strict and often hypocritical. They condemned any signs of promiscuity, but many led double lives. The main thing was to keep up appearances at all costs. Members of the upper middle class sought to emulate the aristocracy. They bought country houses, hired servants, and tried to give their children a classical education. However, the aristocracy still looked down on them as upstarts. The lower middle class, consisting of small traders and clerks, lived in constant tension. Their incomes were modest, and any illness or loss of work could throw them into the ranks of the working class. They clung desperately to their precarious position. This class was a product of the Industrial Revolution. They believed in progress, hard work, and self-improvement, and they had no sympathy for those who, in their opinion, did not want to follow these principles. Thus, it was the fear and desire for stability of the middle class that became the foundation for the most brutal social institutions of the era. They supported a system that kept in check those they feared becoming. It was the price they paid for their own well-being. The base of the Victorian pyramid was the working class, millions of people who labored in factories, mines, and docks. Their lives were an endless series of hard work and struggle for survival. They were the fuel that powered the Industrial Revolution. The working day lasted from 12 to 16 hours, 6 days a week. The work was monotonous and often dangerous. Safety precautions were virtually non-existent, and industrial accidents were commonplace. Living conditions were no better. Workers' families huddled in cramped, overcrowded houses in industrial areas. The streets were dirty and sanitary conditions were appalling. Wages were so low that everyone had to work to support their families. Women and teenagers worked alongside men, but were paid much less for their labor. This was considered the normal state of affairs. For the working class, the workhouse was a constant and real threat. Any injury, illness, or dismissal could bring a family to the brink of poverty. They were just one step away from the abyss into which the subclass had already fallen. Despite the harsh conditions, they had their own culture and sense of community. Pubs, trade unions, and neighborhood ties helped them survive. They were a separate world with their own rules and traditions. They looked at the inhabitants of workhouses with contempt and fear. For a working man, it was a matter of honor to support his family on his own, without resorting to state assistance. Ending up in a workhouse meant complete defeat. Unlike the underclass, they had jobs, no matter how hard they were. This gave them a certain status and sense of dignity. They were poor but honest workers. However, their position was extremely unstable. Economic crises regularly led to mass layoffs. During such periods, the difference between a worker and a pauper became almost indistinguishable. Their labor created wealth that was enjoyed by the middle class and the aristocracy, but they themselves received only crumbs from this wealth. They were cogs in a huge machine that could easily be replaced. At the very bottom of Victorian society was the subclass, those we would today call homeless. These were people without permanent jobs or housing, beggars, vagrants. They lived in the most terrible slums, such as London's East End. Their lives were a chaotic struggle for survival. They scraped by on odd jobs, begging, or petty theft. Every day was devoted to finding food and shelter. To society, they were not just poor, but a dangerous class. They were feared and despised, considered a source of disorder. It was primarily to control this group that the workhouse system was created. They had nothing, no property, no reputation, no hope for the future. They were completely excluded from respectable society. For Victorian morality, they were the living embodiment of vice. Many of them were people broken by life, former workers who had been injured, ruined craftsmen. Having lost their footing, they slid to the very bottom, from where there was no return. It was the lowest rung of the social ladder. The slums in which they lived were labyrinths of narrow, dirty streets. The houses were dilapidated and overcrowded. Their own laws reigned here, and the police tried to show up as little as possible. These people made up the bulk of the workhouses. For them, even the strict regime and humiliating labor were better than hunger and cold on the streets. They chose between bad and terrible. In the eyes of the rest of society, they were invisible. People tried not to notice them and avoided their neighborhoods. They were the underside of the glittering Victorian era, its dark secret. The existence of this subclass was a convenient bogeyman for the working and middle classes. Looking at them, people appreciated their modest but stable position even more. This reinforced the social hierarchy. Thus, Victorian society was clearly divided into castes, and at the very bottom, in complete isolation, were those whom the system could not or would not integrate. They were the dregs of progress, hidden from view in the labyrinths of slums and the walls of workhouses. We looked behind the glittering facade of the Victorian era and saw a world built on stark contrasts. On the one hand, there was luxury and faith in progress. On the other, there was a methodically constructed system of oppression hidden behind the walls of workhouses. These institutions were not just shelters, but veritable hidden prisons for those who had no place in the new industrial world. Their architecture, daily routine, meaningless labor, and scientific approach to nutrition all served one purpose: to break people's will and make poverty shameful. It was an era that feared compassion more than poverty and preferred to hide its social problems behind high brick walls. The history of these places is a powerful reminder of how easily society can sacrifice humanity for the sake of order and efficiency. Do you think there are hidden prisons in our modern world? Systems or institutions that isolate and suppress unnecessary people under a plausible pretext? Share your opinion in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next investigations into the dark pages of history.